Hey, good evening, everybody. It's good to see you. Glad that you're with us on this Memorial Day weekend. I want to say welcome to you to the 6 o'clock Muse. This is our third installment on our series called Only the Broken, and we'll get down to it because it's a few minutes after 6 here in Texas. So we're going to be going back in our Bibles this morning. If you have one and you want to follow along, you won't have to thumb through very many pages to get where we're going because we'll be in the book of Genesis. I've chosen the title Band of Brothers for a couple of reasons. First, because it fits the story that we're going to explore tonight in our stroll down the biblical boulevard of broken people, people that God redeemed and repurposed. Second, because this is Memorial Day weekend, and I want to pause and remember the more than 1.1 million American soldiers who have died on battlefields, foreign and domestic. Jesus himself said, "Greater love has no man than this, or no person than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends." You know, I used to think it was strange back in the early days of my ministry and adulthood. I thought it was strange that we wished each other happy Memorial Day. It seemed oxymoronic to me. It seemed like we ought to observe this day in a more somber and sober fashion. I mean, Memorial Day has a heavy tone, and what we're remembering are those who gave their lives in the line of duty in defending our freedoms. And I thought this to the point of aggravation at times with people who seem to enjoy the fruits of freedom's tree in their backyard barbecues and pool parties and lake excursions without remembering that the tree of freedom may have luscious fruit, but it certainly has bloody roots. And then one day, years ago, I came across a quote from one of America's greatest generals. They called him Blood and Guts, George S. Patton. And Patton said, "It is foolish and wrong to mourn the men who died. Rather, we should thank God such men lived." That kind of adjusted my viewpoint a little bit when I saw what the great general had said, and I realized that it is a time to celebrate, and we ought to celebrate their lives as much as we reflect upon the sacrifice that they made. And I say let's celebrate the sacrifice of our soldiers the way we do the resurrection of our Lord. As brutal and cruel as the cross might be, without it, there's no resurrection, there's no hope, there's no salvation. And as shameful as some would say war is, and maybe shameful and unnecessary the way some see it, and that the death of its participants is a major waste, let's remember that freedom is not free, and it certainly isn't cheap. So I do want to sincerely wish you a safe and happy Memorial Day weekend. I hope you will get to celebrate it with the ones that you love, and that you'll be able to celebrate it in whatever fashion that you desire. And while doing that, I want to call your attention to a less glorious but certainly notorious band of brothers. And like I said earlier, we'll go all the way back in our study this evening to the very first book of the Bible. And we're going to read a few passages from it, the book of Genesis. And I want you to realize that before Israel was a nation, it was a family. And before it was a family, it was a man. And that man had 12 sons. And this is their story. So I'm breaking it into 3 parts. Part 1, I would like to call the family circus. I want to take a rather aerial approach to this story because there's just so much there. We could spend a year or more digging into the lives of these men and their influence. But we're going to have to take we're just going to have to do a flyover and look at some of the high points and see what we can gather from their lives. And remember that we're talking about broken people. And so I feel certain that most of you know at least parts of this story to some degree. These brothers were born to Jacob. They were spread among 4 moms. There were 2 wives who happened also to be sisters, Leah and Rachel. Leah, the Bible tells us, was not much to look at, but she was a sweet gal and a baby-making machine. Rachel, on the other hand, for a long time was unable to have children, and it was a real source of frustration for Rachel and a source of pride for Leah that she could have the kids that Rachel couldn't have, and so that was kind of the favor the Lord played Leah because she was not favored by her husband. And then there were two handmaids that got into the mix, and their names sound like cigarette lighter brands to me, Zilpah and Bilhah. Zilpah was Leah's handmaid, and she gave Jacob two sons, Gad and Asher. I have a nephew named Asher. I don't have any named Gad. I'd like for somebody to do that. Bilhah was Rachel's servant, and she also became Jacob's wife, and she bore Dan and Naphtali. I've known a few Dans, haven't met my first Naphtali. And here's poor Rachel. She was the prettier one. She was Jacob's favorite for no other reason than she was the prettier one. And she was in this fix because she couldn't have children, even though her sister and these two handmaids were having babies left and right. And so in Genesis chapter 30, we pick up the story where Rachel confronts Jacob about her situation. And I'll tell you what, let's just read it because it's a doozy. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing any children for Jacob, she envied her sister. And she said, "Give me children or I'll die." And Jacob became angry with Rachel and said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld children from you?" Then she said, "Here's my maidservant, Bilhah. Sleep with her that she may bear children for me so that through her I too can build a family." So Rachel gave Jacob her servant Bilhah as a wife, and he slept with her, and Bilhah conceived and bore him a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me. He has heard my plea and given me a son," so she named him Dan. And Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again. So apparently this became an ongoing situation for Jacob. And she conceived again and had a second son. And Rachel said, "In my struggles I've wrestled with my sister and won." So she named him Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she gave her servant Zilpah to Jacob as a wife. And Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "How fortunate." So she named him Gad. When Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, Leah said, "How happy am I, for the women call me happy." So she named him Asher. Now during the wheat harvest, Reuben went out and found some mandrakes in the field. When he brought them to his mother, Rachel begged Leah. Reuben was the oldest of the children, the first of Leah's sons. Rachel begged Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." Leah replied, "Is it not enough that you've taken away my husband? Now you want my son's mandrakes as well?" "Very well," said Rachel. "You can sleep. He may sleep with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes." I told you it's a sordid story. When Jacob came in from the field that evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come with me, for I've hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he slept with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore a fifth son to Jacob. Then Leah said, "God has rewarded me for giving my handservant to my husband." So she named him Issachar. Again Leah conceived and bore a sixth son to Jacob. "God has given me a good gift. This time my husband will honor me because I have borne him six sons." And she named him Zebulun. After that, Leah gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel. So all of this had gone on, and now Jacob has 10 sons by 3 women, and Rachel has no sons. Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. And she said, "God has taken away my shame." She named him Joseph and said, "May the Lord add to me another son." And later he would, and she would name him Benjamin. You know, as a parent of adult children now, I've learned that there's so many ways that parents can screw up their kids. And it seems like Jacob and his wives thought of just about all of them. You see why I call it the family circus. It was a real mess. Yeah, I mean, it was, can you even imagine the atmosphere that these children grew up in? The 2 sisters are fighting like sisters who happen to share a husband. I bet Jacob lived for the summertime when the days were longer and he could stay out in the field more of the day, because when he came home, business picked up in town, I'm telling you for sure. The sisters fought over Jacob. They badgered each other. They competed. And Jacob, for his part, favored the pretty one for no other reason than she was the pretty one. Then the jealous sisters, in an effort to outperform each other, they have the bright idea of introducing more women into the mix. And so you can say that this family of Jacob's put the dis in dysfunctional. Just remember, when you learn a little bit down the road here as we go through this story, as you learn what these boys do, just remember what they learned. Just remember the atmosphere in which they were raised and the examples that were set before them. They were not great examples. So part one is the family circus. Part two, I'm going to call brothers in arms. For a long time there, Joseph was the baby in the family. And Jacob being, if nothing else, consistent in his ways as a husband and a father, once again we see Jacob favoring somebody. Remember, as he had these wives, he favored one over the other. And now he has all of these sons. He has all of these sons, and he favors the baby. He favors Joseph. And this has expected results and unintended consequences. The expected results are the older brothers are jealous, and the unintended consequences we'll get to in a minute. And to make matters worse, Joseph he's a little bit brash, you know. I mean, he kind of puts it in their face. Joseph is a dreamer, and he has some dreams, and in those dreams, he reveals to his brothers that he sees a day, or he dreamed that there would be a day when they would all bow down to him. And of course, they're already miffed about the fact that Daddy favors Joseph over the rest of them, gives him all the attention, gives him that beautiful coat of many colors that we're all aware of. And now Joseph is going to talk about one day he's going to be their ruler? I don't think so. And then the next dream he has indicates that not only will his brothers fall down before him, but even his mom and dad will he'll one day rule over them as well. And so Dad's like, I don't think so, son. You're out of your mind. So the brothers are fed up with the favoritism from Pops, and they're annoyed by baby brothers crowing about them someday bowing to him. And that's when things get interesting. We go over to Genesis chapter 37, and we pick up in verse 12. Sometime later, Joseph's brothers had gone to pasture their father's flocks near Shechem. Israel said to him, now their other brothers had to work, Joseph didn't. And Israel, which Jacob's name had become Israel in the course between Genesis chapter 30 and Genesis 37, there's a significant event that happens, and God changes his name from Jacob to Israel. So Israel said to him, are not your brothers pasturing the flocks at Shechem? Get ready, I'm sending you to them. And Joseph said, I'm ready. Then Israel told him, go and see how your brothers and the flocks are faring, and bring word back to me. Go check on things, see how things are going. It'll be a good trip for you, and it'll be good for the brothers to see you and all that stuff. So he went off from the valley of Hebron, and when Joseph arrived in Shechem, a man found him wandering in the field and asked, what are you looking for? And he said, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you please tell me where they're pasturing their flocks? He said, they moved on from here. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph set out after his brothers and went to Dothan. Now Joseph's brothers saw him in the distance, and before he arrived, they plotted to kill him. They said, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We can say that a vicious animal has devoured him. Then we shall see what becomes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, remember Reuben's the oldest. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue Joseph from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed his blood. Throw him into this pit in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Don't hurt him. Reuben said this so that he could rescue Joseph from their hands and return him to their father. So Reuben had a plan to come back later and help Joseph get back to dad. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors he was wearing, and they took him and they threw him in the pit. Now the pit was empty, no water in it. And as they sat down to eat a meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were carrying spices, balm, and myrrh on their way down to Egypt. So these were traders. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him, for he's our brother, our own flesh. And they agreed. So when the Midianite traders passed by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone. What am I going to do?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a young goat, and dipped the robe in its blood. They sent the robe of many colors to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe or not." His father recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A vicious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth around his waist, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will go down to the grave mourning for my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and a captain of the guard. So Reuben, the oldest of the brothers and the one ostensibly in charge and the one responsible to his father to seeing that things go well and are done the right way, he's also the closest thing we have as of a voice to reason among these brothers. And he's the one that's responsible for saving his baby brother from being murdered. And if you wonder if these guys were really capable of killing somebody, just go back when you have time, go back a few chapters and read about what happened when their sister Dinah was corrupted by another man, and how these brothers avenged her rape. And their revenge was brilliant, brutal, and ruthless. So they had it in them. And they may very well have killed Joseph. They may very well have become murderers had it not been for the influence of Reuben. But even Reuben bore responsibility as Joseph is sold by his brothers into slavery and then ends up in Egypt. So that brings me to part 3, the most important, the most significant part of this whole thing. And that is a reckoning, a redemption, and a reconciliation. So this lesson tonight is focused more on the brothers who betrayed Joseph and not so much on Joseph himself. Joseph's life, his life story, is one of the most incredible in written history. He went from favored son to prisoner to prime minister, from favored son to slave to prisoner to prime minister of Egypt. It's a remarkable story. And Egypt at that time was literally the world's only superpower, economically and militarily. Joseph's greatest accomplishment as Pharaoh's right-hand man, once he was elevated to that position, was to prepare Egypt for the 7-year famine, the drought that was coming. When the world around them would be starving and dying by the droves, Egypt would have more than enough. They gained even more power and wealth as they became the world's pantry, thanks to the leadership and foresight of Joseph. This caused Joseph to be the most revered individual, the most celebrated individual in all of Egypt. From Pharaoh on down, the entire country recognized the greatness and the wisdom and the power of Joseph. So his is a remarkable story. And that famine that we just talked about is what brings this band of brothers back face to face with the betrayed. It's such a big story to tell, and you can read about it in detail in Genesis 42 and 43, 2 whole chapters. But let me give you the highlights. Jacob, who's known as Israel because God changed his mind. Israel means prince with God. Jacob, now Israel, sends his sons to Egypt to buy grain because of the famine. They get word, as everybody else has, that Egypt has plenty while everybody else is suffering. So he sends his son with silver to buy grain so that they can survive this terrible famine. Benjamin, the baby in the family, the only son that Joseph doesn't know, the one that was born to Rachel after Joseph was gone, did not go with them. Joseph, when his brothers come to Egypt to buy the grain, Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they don't recognize him. I mean, they wouldn't be looking for him at all. They assume that he's long gone, that he's old news, that he's history. And so they're not looking for Joseph, and they don't recognize Joseph. There's been a lot of change in Joseph through these years, but Joseph recognizes them. They're just older and a little more stooped, and still the bitter band of brothers that he had known from so many years ago. And so he decides to test them to see if they are still the duplicitous, jealous bunch that they had always been. And so he says, look, I'll let you buy grain and I'll do business with you and I'll make sure that you have enough to get through this famine. But I want to meet your younger brother. You go back and bring Benjamin to meet me. And when you do that, then I'll do business with you. But to make sure you come back, I'm going to take this brother over here, Simeon, and put him in prison and hold him until you return. And so they don't want to do that, but they ultimately agree that they will do that. So Joseph allows them to buy grain to get them by until they can get back. And then he sends them on their way. And while they're on their way, they discover in their bags that the silver that they had paid for the grain is in the bags. So they have the grain and the money, and they're like, what in the world is happening? God's getting us after all these years. They become paranoid. Did you steal it? No. Did you steal it? No. I didn't touch it. I didn't take it. What's going on? They're going to realize that that we've taken our own money and the grain, and they're going to hunt us down and kill us like dogs. This is God getting even with us. So the brothers go home. They tell Jacob that they have to take Benjamin back. Jacob's very distraught, and he goes through his melodramatic lamenting again, saying, if anything happens to Jacob, it'll surely kill me. I've already lost one precious son. I can't lose another. So the brothers do bring Benjamin. And Joseph meets Benjamin for the first time. And Joseph decides to test them again to see if they will sacrifice Benjamin the way they had sacrificed him for their own good. And so, once again, Jacob sabotages them. Jacob sabotages Benjamin by putting his own personal silver cup in Benjamin's bag. He declares it missing. He orders that the bags be searched, and the cup is discovered in Benjamin's bag. And this is what happened in Genesis chapter 44, beginning in verse 18. Then Judah approached Joseph. Now remember, Judah's the one who had the bright idea of profiting off of selling Joseph. Let's don't kill him when we can sell him for a profit, and we won't have his blood on our hands. So you just remember that was Judah who influenced the other brothers to sell Joseph in the first place. Then Judah approached Joseph and said, Sir, please, let your servant speak personally to my Lord. Do not be angry with your servant, for you are an equal to Pharaoh. My Lord asked his servants, do you have a father or brother? And we answered, we have an elderly father and a younger brother, the child of his old age. The boy's brother is dead. He's the only one of his mother's sons left, and his father loves him. Then you told your servants, bring him to me so that I can see him for myself. So we said to my Lord, the boy cannot leave his father. If he were to leave, his father would die. But you said to your servants, unless your younger brother comes down with you, you will not see my face again. So he's rehearsing everything. He said, this is why Benjamin's here in the first place. Now when we returned to your servant, my father, we relayed your words. Then our father said, go back and buy some food. But we answered, we cannot go there unless our younger brother goes with us. So if our younger brother is not with us, we cannot see the man. And your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. When one of them was gone, I said, surely he's been torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. Now, if you also take this one from me and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray hair down to the grave in sorrow. So if the boy is not with us when I return to your servant, and if my father, whose life is wrapped up in the boy's life, sees that the boy is not with us, he'll die. Then your servants will have brought the gray hair of your servant our father down to the grave in sorrow. Indeed, your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father, saying, if I do not return him to you, I will bear the guilt before you, my father, all my life. So Judah put his own life on the line and said, Father, I promise you on my life, I will get Benjamin back to you safely. Now, please, let your servant stay here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy. Let him return with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father without the boy? I could not bear to see the misery that would overwhelm me. What a change, huh? What a change in Judah through the years. Judah was the one who sold Joseph into slavery. Judah was the one that started this whole slavery business. He's the one that started the ball rolling. And now Judah is saying, I will be your slave. Whatever you would do to Benjamin, do to me instead. But please don't hold Benjamin accountable for this. He doesn't know whether Benjamin's taken that cup or not. All he knows is that he had given his word to his father. You see the difference there? You see the difference in Judah? Now he's willing to sacrifice life and limb to keep baby brother Benjamin from a terrible fate. So here's what happens in Genesis chapter 45. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants, and he cried out, send everyone away from me. So none of them were with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. But he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household soon heard of it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But they were unable to answer him because they were terrified in his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, please come near me. And they did so. He said, I'm Joseph, your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves that you sold me into this place, because it was to save lives that God sent me before you. For the famine has covered the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvest. God sent me before you to preserve you as a remnant on the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God, who has made me a father to Pharaoh, Lord of all his household and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Man, can you imagine what that was like to hear that story, to hear Joseph's journey and to realize that this man that the most powerful nation on earth revered so greatly, this man who was responsible single-handedly for saving this great country from the famine, is the brother they betrayed. So they're allowed to go back, and Pharaoh gets involved, and Pharaoh says, I'll tell you what you do. You go get your dad, you get all your stuff, and you move here to the land of Goshen. Goshen is a land where there's plenty of resources. It's very near to the capital, and you'll be under my protection. You'll be under the protection of my people, and we'll treat you with honor and dignity. You just bring your dad and your family here because of Joseph. And so Jacob and the family are able to move to Goshen, and Jacob is reunited with his son, Joseph. And soon after that, Jacob dies, an old man. And Jacob's death is a national event in Egypt. Pharaoh himself sees to it that he's properly lamented and honored and buried where he asked to be buried. But once Jacob's out of the picture, once Jacob is gone, Joseph's brothers, still ridden with guilt and shame, are sure that Joseph will now exact his revenge. They've convinced themselves that the only reason Joseph didn't get revenge before was because of his love for his father. But now Dad's gone, and what will Joseph do? So we go to Genesis chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph bears a grudge? Then he'll surely repay us for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent word to Joseph saying, before he died, your father commanded, this is what you are to say to Joseph. I beg you, please forgive the transgression and sin of your brothers, for they did you wrong. So now Joseph, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers also came to him, bowed down before him, and said, we are your slaves. Joseph replied, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? As for you, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. In order to accomplish a day like this, to preserve the lives of many people. Therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. So Joseph reassured his brothers and spoke kindly to them. These men who had lived an entire life ridden with guilt and regret, this band of brothers with blood on their hands, were at long last rescued, redeemed, and restored. And if you should wonder about the significance of their lives, remember this. Their father Jacob is Israel, a prince with God. These men were literally the children of Israel. And these men would father the 12 tribes of Israel. And their family would become a nation, God's people. What they meant for evil, God meant for good. What they did out of jealousy, God allowed in his providence. Even while they disgraced themselves, God had built into their very actions their own saving grace. And isn't that how God works? Look at Calvary. Wicked men sought to destroy Jesus. With jealous hands they took him. With lying lips they betrayed him. With wicked hearts they cried, "Crucify him. We will not have him to be Lord over us." Do you hear how they echoed the words of their forefathers concerning Joseph? The original children of Israel hated the dreamer, and their descendants hated the dream. So they crucified Jesus. But what they meant for evil, God meant for good. God meant it for good. Remember that in your brokenness. Remember that in your guilt. Remember that in your shame. There has not been, nor will there ever be, a moment when God is not sovereign, gracious, and good. Come, ye sinners, lost and lonely. Jesus' blood can make you free. For he saved the worst among you when he saved a wretch like me. And I know Jesus' blood can make the vilest sinner clean. Only the broken will ever know the power of God in their lives. God bless you. Have a great weekend. Thank you.